Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Short.
I'm your co-host, Rich Gear, here with you. And we have Jeff, who is going to expound upon why do we wear clothes and no other creature does, and why aren't we all naked? What a great topic. What's the name of this show, Doug?
Why do we wear clothes? And Jeff, I see that you are wearing clothes.
Yeah, well, that's a good idea, too.
Well,
I'm glad you do.
we're all clothed, which is good, because I really wouldn't feel comfortable. And it's nice and warm in here, so really there's no reason, actually.
No.
We're all comfortable. I mean, everybody could kind of lay around in the nude if we wanted to. I mean, if we felt comfortable enough. But no one really feels comfortable, do they?
No. Anyway, so we're going to start off with evolutionary reasons for why we wear clothes. Is that right? And then we're going to get into the biblical reasons, probably.
Yeah,
right?
This was pretty great.
So I'm looking forward to this. All right, Jeff, begin.
So one of the major reasons that is given to us why, and it's mysterious because they can't go back. Clothing doesn't fossilize very well. And neither does hair. So there was a time in the hominid history, the evolutionary, hypothetical, from our point of view, really the false history of human beings come into existence. There was a time when the hominids had a coat of fur, just like an ape would. At some point along the way, we lost that.
Right.
There are various theories why.
So there are several theories as to why but they all agree, because evolutionary scenarios say we all come from ape-like hominids, which were basically apes, okay, and they were covered with fur. So we don't have fur. I mean, we have hair and a few spots. We have little light things, but basically, although we're not hairless, we're fairly light compared to every other ape-like.
Most
creature.
mammals, right?
Yeah.
Most large mammals have some kind of hair,
right.
Or they have some. There are some bigger ones that may have like a tough coat, a tough skin.
Yeah, like the rhino or the hippopotamus. Well, they're in the water a lot.
Pig.
A pig. But pigs actually are hairy.
But they go foraging through the woods and they don't seem to get hurt.
Yeah, pigs actually do have hair.
We're very fragile, I notice.
Yeah.
You go crashing through the woods, you're going to get...
So they got to come up with a scenario as to why we lost the fur. So how many... So
the aquatic ape hypothesis?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, this says that there was a time and I'm taking these facts. I would put scare quotes around that. The facts from various articles, various studies. These are university professors that have written these studies and really looked into this issue. So one of the hypotheses, 6 to 8 million years ago, we were ape-like in our ancestry. We were ape-like, and we had a semi-aquatic lifestyle. So we were part in the water a lot of the time. And so a coat of fur really wasn't good for insulation in the water. So therefore, we evolved. We lost the fur to and grew more of a lot of fatty tissue instead to insulate us while we were in the water. So that's one theory, which people have problems with that.
So there was
I have a problem with that.
some entity out there that decided this and made that the selection. Is that what you're saying?
Well, in the evolutionary theory, everything seems to work because anything that didn't have the advantageous thing dies, and then they're not in the record anymore, and therefore, really, it's an absence of evidence which proves the theory.
Right.
Really, when it comes down to it.
Yeah, which never works. Okay.
But there are other theories. So,
okay. What's the next one?
Going on to the next one, we have when we started to migrate out into the hotter regions, the African savanna, for example, we began to overheat, and therefore we had to lose our fur. So that means that the furrier hominids would lose or would overheat, and they would be less fit for that environment. And so the smoother skinned hominids would survive and go on.
The problem I have with that is you still have chimpanzees, apes,
Lions are actually on the savannah,
Yeah, and they're all fur. Yeah, we're happy to beat the band. They got all kinds of fur. You know,
I mean, they just have to have a source of water.
It just doesn't really make sense to me.
There are baboons on the savannah. They're
Exactly.
yeah. But so that one doesn't make much sense either. There's another one where there were too many parasites in our fur.
Now that one has a little bit more.
And so, you know, the furry coat would provide a safe haven for all these parasites. And so the more parasites you had, the more you would die. And therefore, the smoother skinned hominids would begin to survive better. And that's why we would lose the fur.
Then why do I get mosquito bit every summer, you know?
Those are parasites. I agree. And then the other one's related to the overheating, the brain. And this is the fourth main
That's why
theory.
we kept our hair.
Well, yeah.
It protected us from the heat.
Yeah.
Because I'm saying John, you know.
It's all confusing to me.
I mean, yeah, because
get it.
you shave your hair off and you get out in the hot area without a hat, you're going to cook your head, you know. Hair is somewhat of an insulator.
Yeah, and a light coat of fur really would take care of a lot of our sunburn issues.
Exactly.
You know, as well. So the whole thing seems fishy to me, but
No,
within the
Especially
system.
Especially the aquatic one, exactly where I was going with that one. Yeah.
But so since our brains were getting bigger over our evolutionary history, we couldn't be out in the hot. We couldn't be covered in fur because that'd be too hot, and so the smoother hominids would survive. And so as long as you were nice and smooth, you would be cooler, and then you develop your sweat glands, which I think is it dogs that can't sweat?
Dogs actually sweat through their tongue and their feet.
Right, but in their fur coat,
no,
they don't, and that's
As I
the
understand
theory.
it, yeah.
That could be part of it, where we shed fur and grew sweat glands miraculously. I guess I don't know.
To me, I've always been amazed at evolutionary anthropomorphism. They ascribe into this natural selection the godlike powers that we ascribe to God. Okay, that basically suddenly it decides it needs something, but it's going to take like 500,000 to 500 million years to get it in place. But it's going to be we're in this for the long run. I mean, evolution is the ultimate gradualist.
Dr. Sanford always talks about is that the population the models do not support this idea of having all these different varieties sitting out there to pick from, and then it just selects down to the right ones, and all this pool of genetic information materializing out of thin air to produce these new features. What you see and observe is that these features don't have any appearance anywhere. They just or any mechanism for their appearance.
A good example would be losing the fur and developing sweat glands.
Right, exactly.
Sweat glands are a very complicated. Just common sense would tell you that your body sort of has a thermostat where it'll turn the sweat on, and then it has to have these little pores that allow the sweat to come out. If you don't have that and you just lose your fur, it's like it would be a miracle for you to lose your fur and then have this system of sweat glands just appear in your body. I don't understand.
Well, see, we're losing furs like in patches, and then a gland appears here. I know, audience, we make it appear foolish, but because we think it is foolish. But this is stuff that gets proposed
and
all the time.
People who are really serious about
very
it.
serious, and they're not intellectually stupid.
They have a lot of letters behind their name.
Yeah, there are a lot of letters behind their name. But they have an agenda and an a priori philosophical system that they have to go here. Remember that old thing was it Ruse? Who's the guy? Can't remember who said that.
Or Lewontin.
No matter how ridiculous the theory is, we have to accept it. If the only alternative is special creation, we cannot allow creation as foot in the door. Basically, I'm paraphrasing badly, but that's the idea. They can't allow that. So that's not really about science. It's really about we have to take anything, and they'll have 100 million theories about things. None of them, on the face of it, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well,
Right.
this one's interesting. You know,
Okay.
the evolution of body lice has something to do with our evolution of.
Oh, yeah, what about that? You started going, is it the parasite thing, or no?
Well, the parasite thing would be one of the reasons we lost our fur.
Okay.
The body lice, basically, and this moves into the clothing issue.
Yeah.
Why do we wear clothes, and when did we begin to wear clothes? First, their estimates on when we lost our fur, somewhere between 240,000 years to 1.2 million years. That somewhere in that time frame would be the time that we lost our fur coats and developed sweat glands and all the miraculous things that apparently take place. Then, somewhere between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, we began to wear clothing. They reached that number by examining the evolution of lice, going from your normal run-of-the-mill, everyday household lice to the clothing lice. See, you have the clothing lice that is distinct from what your hair lice and the lice in your fur, etc. So they trace the evolutionary history of lice to figure out when we evolutionarily developed the ability to design and make clothes and begin to wear clothes.
And they go, that's
So-
250,000?
Well, and I've heard that boiled down to a University of Florida study pinned it down to somewhere around 170,000 years. So 170,000 years ago, approximately, we began to wear clothes. Okay. And I'm kind of wondering, you know, say take the high number, 1.2 million years. We went naked for hundreds of thousands of years between, and that's one of my questions when I consider all this. We went all that time being completely naked and exposed to the elements, and never with a stitch of clothing, and then suddenly, after hundreds of thousands of years of existence, with apparently not needing any clothing, we apparently did fine in the wild and with the ultraviolet rays, and even when it got cold, we did fine. And then suddenly, we gained this magical ability to, we're going to create clothing and wear it. No other creature on Earth wears clothes. But this is, since we wear clothes, we have to have an evolutionary
I don't know, I've seen some
explanation.
poodles with some clothing on it, no. Some of these dog things.
Yeah. But they
But
didn't get up in the morning.
we foisted upon them, they don't do it voluntarily.
Yeah, they're not shopping at the mall.
Yeah,
Well, enough of this nonsense. Let's go into the biblical reasons why we wear clothes.
yeah.
Right, and you know, one of the evolutionary reasons, shame. It is common knowledge that people are ashamed of being naked. I mean,
Kind of
it's like
alluded
an
to that in the beginning.
instinctive thing.
Yeah.
And it's another thing that needs to be explained in the evolutionary worldview. And so they do come up with a few different reasons why shame would be beneficial in the evolutionary worldview. They would say, well, shame stops you from doing antisocial behaviors so that the society, you'll survive better if the society is not against you, see.
Okay.
So if I did something shameful, right,
Right.
you guys would be against me. You'd be mad and be like, no, you shouldn't do that. And then you'd ostracize me, and then I wouldn't survive. You know, I'd be outside the community.
Right.
But if I have a feeling of shame within me that stops me from doing the shameful thing, that's evolutionarily advantageous.
And the idea-
And clothing ties into that.
Ties into that, okay, yeah. Well, and that's interesting that they would come up with a thing about shame when you're thinking that you've got to put into a survival reason for it, because shame is a moral component, not generally a physiological or a sociological. Well, sociological can go into those things, but there's something that's inherently different about us having the need for clothing. Like you say, no other animal seems to be bothered too much by it. So our large brain capacities,
Or at all.
or at all, yeah. And so we have this need for clothing now. You do have a little note here out. Even Darwin argues that the loss of fur gave no survival advantage. So the loss of fur, so it's kind of pointless to try those other things we talked about. These are really kind of like straw men really were knocking over because you're really not taking it seriously.
It doesn't fit in the evolutionary paradigm, yet it exists. So we wear clothes. We're ashamed of being naked. We don't have a coat of fur.
Right.
It has to be explained, even though it doesn't fit the paradigm.
Yeah.
So what he would say is, first, he admits. Now, this is Darwin, godfather of evolution. He admits reduced cover of hair, fur, a coat of fur, was to lose that, basically, was of no direct advantage to our ancestors, and perhaps even in a slight degree injurious. Now, this is Darwin talking.
Yeah.
But was inherited because it was sexually esteemed. So he takes and he says, he basically says, if you have smooth skin, you're more desirable sexually.
Yeah, you are the peacock.
The peacock's tail is the analogy that's made.
Oh, I see.
Just like the peacock's tail. They can't explain that evolutionarily either. Why the peacock's tail? It seems that it would make the peacock more vulnerable to attackers.
It would be, yeah.
And yet it's there. So they come up with a sexual selection explanation. So it's evolutionary advantageous because of, well, obviously they like to mate with those types. So therefore it's an advantage. And the ones that don't have it will die.
And it's easy to substantiate these explanations because, I have to say, it's obviously the natural selection which led to our current condition, and everyone who was not fit didn't survive.
That's what you're saying, yeah.
So the wearing of clothes gave an evolutionary advantage. So you assume what you want to prove.
Right. And it is circular. And so, yeah, I mean, and that is interesting. The circular nature of the whole evolutionary explanation of these type of phenomenon is so obvious if you just take a minute and think through it. It's being assumed, and then you use the thing you assume to prove what you have assumed.
Yeah.
So it's a complete circle, and not the way to reason. It's not. It's actually a fallacy.
Yeah.
So, but the biblical reasons for clothing, I think, make a lot more sense. I don't know about you guys, but
They definitely do to me too.
So.
And we can extrapolate and come up with theories too, but we have to. We start out with what we believe is the Word of God, and it tells you why we have clothing. And it was interesting because everyone knows the story. Pretty much, I don't care whether they're pagans, atheists, even Buddhists and Hindus. Pretty much everyone knows the story of Adam and Eve. You know, they know the story of the first human pair. Okay. And that they were in a perfect place called the Garden of Eden, or whatever. Even old stories, when you get Hopi Indians and they all have stories of the first man and woman. That God created them, or the gods create whatever. And they messed up, and they were kicked out. But the big thing about it is they, instead of hundreds of thousands of years running around free as a bird, not having a problem being naked, they knew right away they were naked, didn't they, Doug?
Right after they sinned. And I think what happened there was God actually had a covering of His glory over His creation. And so...
this is what you and I were talking, this is what I was talking to you about
right.
yesterday. And keep going. Because
and as He lived righteously in perfect unbroken fellowship with God, there was nothing to be ashamed of. And the naked of unashamed state, it was not hostile to this physical well-being. And so God provided a perfect environment for human beings to dwell in, and all their needs were being met, and there was no danger from their surroundings, and so there was no need for clothing.
Right. No shame, no hostile environment, and they weren't aware of being naked.
Right.
And what's interesting is
the thing I was going to ask you a question. And Doug and I were talking about. I presented this to Doug. Now this is an extrapolation. Do not take this as a biblical thing. It's a thought or a theory I've had for quite some time that Adam and Eve knew they were naked immediately upon taking the bite of the fruit. What was it that they saw or experienced that indicated something was changed? Was the fruit some magical fruit that suddenly they got the knowledge of good and evil? Maybe. I have a theory, and it's based on the idea that I think that before the fall of man, they were covered in the glory of God. Just like when Jesus talked to the Father at the Mount of Transfiguration, he was shining with the glory of God. When Moses talked to Jesus in his pre-incarnate stage, the Lord, his face had to be covered with a veil. And I think that glory of God, because they could talk to God face to face and not die. I think they were covered with spirit. Just as the way our skeleton is covered with flesh. And I think that's why in Genesis chapter 6, the sin that God says when they fell right away, but then later on he says they have become flesh. The cursed earth, which wasn't cursed when it was first made, but the earth which I made you, that's subsumed everything about you. The glory that you once had is now totally, it's so buried inside, you can't even get out, And that's just a kind of a thought. There's a couple other things like that too. Like, and Doug, I don't know, Doug remember? I think you remember it. But there was a book called Genesis in the Chinese language, and there was a couple of words. Apparently, and this is all speculation, but it's kind of it makes sense to me, from a biblical standpoint. It definitely doesn't contradict Scripture.
Yeah, the Chinese character is for what was it? It was representing.
I think one was happiness or sanctuary. I'm not really sure. Or something was bliss or contentment or something. It was 2 miles in a garden with God, and the human figures had flames over their heads. And then words that were like, there was a word that I can't remember when they were like. There was one with 8 miles in a boat.
Right.
Well, that was for the ark,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But they had no flames over their head then. That was a word after the fall. So I'm wondering, and then interestingly enough, remember when at Pentecost we hear about flames over their head when the Spirit comes upon them. And I'm going, I wonder if they really saw a difference as soon as they ate that fruit, that glory was stripped from them. And that's why they knew. And so, anyway, that's a long aside, but I thought
that's actually tied in. That's actually tied into some of the stuff I read, because in the beginning, they did have that glory. They were clothed,
you talked about that, Doug, yeah.
They were clothed with that glory.
Yeah.
And what was interesting, when they ate, they became aware of their sin without God giving them a law or explaining it to them. They immediately knew. And then there was another interesting, which I hadn't really thought about, but a couple of different people that I read pointed this out. And again, I'm taking this from theologians and various people who've written on the subject. They were ashamed of their reproductive parts. That's what they tried to cover up.
Yeah.
They didn't try to cover up their hand or their head or their chest, or maybe for the woman, the chest.
Yeah.
But the things that were to do with reproduction, those were the things. And someone pointed out, and I think it was a Presbyterian pastor, Nick Badsick. He wrote an article about this called "A Biblical Theology of Clothing." And from that article, he quotes various Presbyterians, and I mean he quotes Edwards, and he quotes some Puritans and stuff like that. They've written on this, and he said they wanted to cover the reproductive parts, and it's weird because it's almost got like God supernaturally associated the shame with the reproductive parts for a reason, as an illustration, because we would pass on the curse of sin to our descendants through procreation, okay? And so the shame that we feel is connected with the sin and connected with reproduction, and it's a symbol basically of the way sin is passed down to the human race. And I thought it was and I think what's really important is how God clothed Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm. Go into that, because that's pretty. We're running out of time, so we want to make sure we get this in because it's good.
Well, and God saw that we were naked and ashamed. We were not only naked and ashamed physically, but we were naked and ashamed before Him because of our sin.
Yeah, spiritual.
So the physical shame was a symbol of the spiritual shame and nakedness that came from sin. Our communion with God was broken, and we hid from God. Out of His grace, out of His love, out of His mercy, out of His kindness, He provided clothing. And how did He provide clothing? And you know how He did it.
Yeah, they had to kill. There had to be an animal. We believe that's the first death. A skin, animal skin. Well, they tried to cover themselves with fig leaves out of the cursed ground. They tried, and that is not good. So only blood was able to alleviate that. This is a type, of course, of Christ and His sacrifice, but it covers you up with animal skins. Mm-hmm. And so there was a covering. That was the first sacrifice. And all cultures, so many of the ancient cultures, had sacrifices. Mm-hmm. This all goes back to the garden, But I also think there's something inherent in us that we know we have lost that glory. I think the reason why the shame is there and why we want to cover ourselves with clothing is we lost the covering of God's glory.
Right.
And
it's only by His grace that we're covered.
And that's the real protection. His glory is the only thing that really protects us. Clothing only protects, it makes us not quite so cold in the wintertime. We get coats and things, but it doesn't really protect us fully, not like the glory of the righteousness of God. Yeah.
And so what I drew from what I read on the subject was that God provided not only for our physical protection, because we were now going to be encountering a hostile world, a physically dangerous world, that we needed shoes now, and we needed clothing, we needed tough skins, and when the thorns would come up against you when you were walking through the jungle, instead of being in a wonderful plush garden, you would be vulnerable.
Thorns
he
and
not
thistles.
only he not only provided for the physical well-being, but the spiritual well-being, because by the shedding of blood there is forgiveness of sins. So God made that first sacrifice, which is a type of Christ. And as we approach Easter, I think it's very, very fitting and apropos that talk about the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, which that first sacrifice is a symbol, a foreshadowing of when Christ gave His life, and that was all by mercy, all by grace. So, and the other thing that strikes me about the whole thing is that how the physical world, how God created it, is a living illustration of spiritual truth. Everywhere you look, whether it's marriage, whether it's bread, Jesus being the bread of life, whether it's a door you walk through to gain access, Jesus is the door, and that first creation, the fall, and God's redemption that He has provided is just the whole earth, the whole creation is a parable, really.
Oh boy, we could go on forever, but we got to wrap it up, don't we, Doug?
Yeah, we're covered by the robes of righteousness of Jesus Christ. We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.